Okay, so let's dive into a few questions here. Melanie is asking, could my long-term diarrhea cause vitamin deficiency? Yeah, absolutely. So long-term diarrhea, if you've got consistent diarrhea, one of the things that's happening is your gut is flushing you out consistently enough. And if it's bad enough, if it's happening especially right after you eat, and that's the trigger, then you may not be absorbing the nutrients from your food. And so very much malnutrition is one of the side effects of chronic diarrhea. We see this very frequently in inflammatory bowel diseases like ulcerative colitis, Crohn's disease, even in cases of celiac disease, where the gut is so inflamed that the food is just being pushed out in diarrhea fashion. And that, again, not only will it cause dehydration and electrolyte loss, but it can cause mineral deficiency. It can cause fat malabsorption like vitamin A, vitamin D, E, and K. Those are fats. Omega-3 fats can become deficient when you have, chronic diarrhea. So absolutely. So the key there is to determine where the chronic diarrhea is coming from. And that, I highly advise you work with a good functional medicine doctor to get that part figured out. Those of you who don't know what functional medicine is, you can visit drpeterosborne.com, and there's an entire page there that discusses what functional medicine actually is. And again, highly recommend that if you're struggling to find an answer and you feel like you're on your own, you're not really getting any resolution from what you're doing, that you work with a qualified functional medicine doc to get you moving in the right direction. Okay. Another one, 10 years into celiac diagnosis, this is from Mark, I was wondering how many older patients gotten accustomed to GI distress if they thought it was normal, something you run across often. Now, I love this question because a lot of times if you grew up with something and you thought it was normal and you adapt that norm into your life as it's not abnormal, then you don't really ever know that it's not normal until either one, it goes away, or two, somebody sheds light on it and helps you understand that that's not normal. I've actually had people come to see me that they were having 6, 7, 8 bowel movements a day, loose bowel movements, basically diarrhea, and thought it was normal. I've had other people not go to the bathroom for 7 days at a time and think that was normal because that's the way it's always been for them. And so, again, it's kind of one of those topics people don't want to talk about, right? Poop. And how often do you poop? But it's a very critical process. It's one of the ways that our digestive tract, it's a quarantine zone from the mouth to the anus. One of its jobs is to help separate the food, the good nutrients from the bad, from the waste. And so we should be having a bowel movement 1 to 2 times a day very easily. And a lot of people don't talk about it because it's embarrassing, the whole topic itself. So a lot of kids, as they're growing up, they don't know what normal is. And their parents aren't following them to the bathroom. And so what ends up happening is they grow up thinking that this norm of having diarrhea all the time, or this norm of only having 1 bowel movement a week, is an actual norm instead of an abnorm. And so yes, the answer to that question is a lot of people have a false perception of what's actually normal. So on that front, everyone listening today should understand that it's very normal to have 1 to 2 solid bowel movements a day. And if you're not doing that, then you may have a problem. And that problem might be some of these things that we're actually talking about today. So Sandy's chiming in. She's saying she's removed as much from her diet as possible without testing. And it's given her great relief and great improvement, but she's still struggling. My advice to you, Sandy, and I don't know if you've done this, but follow the 30-day protocol in No Grain, No Pain. In essence, really skip to phase 2. There's phase 1, which is the first 15 days, which is chapter 7, and then there's phase 2, which is chapter 8. Just skip right to chapter 8 and dive into chapter 8. And if that's not doing the trick for you in 30 days, I really highly recommend you start budgeting for some of the types of testing that can give you a little bit more accuracy in terms of which foods you might be consuming. Because a lot of people where this problem doesn't go away and they've done everything right in the diet that they know to try to do, it's one of 2 things. Either it's a hidden food that they're reacting to, they're having an inflammatory response, so we'll call that a delayed allergy. Okay, and you have to test for these. You can't guess them. It's impossible to guess because the window of reaction for a delayed allergy is 3 hours to 3 weeks. So if you're trying to guess that, you'll never hit the mark in an accurate way. The other thing though is stress. is because, and this is a big problem around food, because a lot of people start cutting out food, and they cut out food as if food is an enemy, and then they develop what I would like to call a food phobia, where the whole act of eating, the whole psychological premise around eating becomes this big phobia. And so every time it's time for a meal or it's time to think about food, their body goes into fight or flight. And when your body goes into fight or flight, the blood supply to your gut is minimized, and it's sent to your periphery and to your brain so that you can run or fight and not digest, right? So if you've developed this kind of a psychological food phobia around all foods, you kind of want to go back to understanding that all food is not necessarily the fundamental only reason why a person can become ill. And there are a lot of other factors involved in this. So again, why I wrote No Grain, No Pain, and spent a lot of time in the earlier chapters talking about some of the lifestyle parameters that you really need to make sure that you're living by, because a lot of people have unresolved stress, unresolved trauma, bad relationships, poor sleep habits, poor exercise habits, lack of sunshine, and they're trying to remove foods from their diet, but they're not doing the fundamental things that have to be done on a consistent day in and day out basis to actually achieve a level of health. So you've got to keep those things in mind as well. We don't just want to blame food. We have to have good choices and good behavior around making good choices about our food. So delayed allergies and stress are two of the big ones. And I would say if you're still struggling with, you can look that up and maybe dial in a little bit more tightly. I like this comment because it's really quite true, and that's apple cider vinegar, a teaspoon or a tablespoon in this case, with several ounces of water 10 minutes before your meal can really help digestion. And this is less to do with foods that cause GI distress and more to do with not having adequate stomach acid, because apple cider vinegar can act as a source of acid in the stomach and aid in digestion. Now, that being said, sometimes what happens is people eat foods that cause GI distress, and the outcome of that is then they take medications to block stomach acid because their perception is that they have acid reflux. And so then they get put on a drug like Nexium or Prilosec or Tagamet or Zantac, etc. And then they start blocking their own stomach acid. And then what happens here is that then all foods start to cause GI distress because they're not digesting it. And then they'll add something in like an apple cider vinegar, which gives them a little bit more acid in terms of their stomach and their capacity to digest foods. And they do digest better. They do feel better. And if you've got that as part of your history, you really got to address this piece up here before, because nothing down here, removing it might be helpful, but as long as that's being suppressed, it's going to create a problem in that way. This is some great feedback you guys are giving tonight. So this is a question from Christopher. What tests should I run to see vitamin mineral deficiencies, food allergies, like Shannon and Jessica? There are several different tests. There's not one test, because there's 7 different ways that you can have a reaction to food. There are multiple different ways that you can have that you can test for vitamin and mineral deficiencies. One of the tests that I can give you a couple of different things here. One of the tests that I really like for vitamin and mineral deficiencies is called a SpectraCell, and that test can be done and it measures more than 30 different nutrients. It doesn't have all the nutrients that I test for. There are some other specific tests that I have to add to this in order to get a comprehensive picture of the 40 different essential nutrients that we really like to measure when when we're trying to evaluate a person's nutritional status. But this is a really good place to start because you do get a lot from one panel. So hopefully that'll help you out. You can call your doc, and a lot of times your doc, you'll say, do you do this? And they'll say no. And I'm going to give you all some advice, because if you know the name of this test and you go to your doctor and your doctor doesn't really order that test, you don't want to go to that doctor to have that test run, because part of this test is interpretation. Even though you can get it and you can look at the result and the lab is going to give you a generic interpretation, if you're doing this and you're trying to troubleshoot your health, you want to work with an expert or a professional. And if that doctor is just ordering it for you as a favor, now you've got this lab that you're left to interpret. And I've seen people a number of times bring these things into me. It was completely misinterpreted. They were on a horrible supplemental regimen. It didn't do them any good, and they lost their money. They lost the value of the test. This test is really great because it gives you a 6-month window to start supplementing or changing your diet in. But if you've got bad advice or you've got no guidance, it may not be enough. A lot of the generic lab recommendations that are provided by the lab, the doses are equivalent to spitting out a forest fire. They're just not high enough to correct certain deficiencies. Remember, the lab has to proceed with caution because they don't have a relationship with that person in a one-on-one basis. And so again, a lot of times to really get good correction of a nutrient deficiency, you've got to go much, much higher doses. And so working with somebody who's an expert who's got experience makes all the difference in the world when you're getting labs like this done, because a lot of people will go just and generally just get the labs done and then they'll try to, do it themselves at home. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't try something. I'm just saying if you're going to start spending money on lab, you need to start spending money on qualified person who can help guide you through that. Otherwise, you end up with a mess and you've wasted a bunch of time and a bunch of money and not gotten anywhere. And then your perception of nutrition and nutritional testing is that it doesn't work. And it's not that it doesn't work, it's that you've got to have the right guidance when you're doing something like this. So again, I can't emphasize that enough. I just see too many people throwing money away and not getting the right advice, or going to another doctor who's not qualified to order nutritional testing because they don't even understand nutrition, but they're going to that doctor and taking that doctor's advice. Again, you've got to find the right type of functional medicine practitioner, in my opinion, if you really want to have a good degree of success in this front. Let's see here. All right, so question coming in on other lab tests. There's a test called a Nutrival. I don't use it. It's basically a urine/blood test. It's not super accurate. The test result can change from day to day. One of the problems when you're measuring nutritional status is you need to have some type of set point marker where when you draw the blood or you take the specimen, that it gives you an average over time. It doesn't give you a moment in time. The example or the analogy is like this. If you go to the movie and I only let you watch the first 30 seconds and then tell you to leave, and then I say, I want you to tell me all about that movie, but you only have 30 seconds access to the 2-hour movie, that's kind of like getting blood work for nutritional testing. When you get that vitamin B12 level measured in your serum, you don't know if it's high or if it's low because of your diet this morning or your diet today. You don't know what was influencing it around that time. Sometimes the liver redistributes nutrients and you can get false elevations or you can get false lows. So understanding that part of it is when you're running tests, you've got to make sure your doctor understands this really well, because they've got to be able to pick and choose the right battery of tests. Otherwise, you're getting misled. You're getting false information. And it's so extremely common for people to get false information from this. More questions about. Look, I don't like talking about other tests. The wheat zoomer as a test overall is the most progressive way to look at some of the different proteins that people can react to as it relates to gluten, but it's still not comprehensive. I mean, we're talking about 1,000 different proteins. There is no lab that measures that. The only accurate way to really truly assess gluten sensitivity, if you want to get super accurate, is genetic testing. You've got to do genetic testing. I'll put a link up here in the feed for you on genetic testing. But if you're not doing genetic testing, the propensity to get false negative is extremely high. I see it all the time. I even see it when people bring in their wheat zoomers, or they'll bring in their other labs from other lab companies where they're measuring things like anti-gliadin antibodies or anti-tissue transglutaminase or some of the celiac panels, and they come back and they've been told eat all the gluten they want, yet when we run their genetic testing, we get an accurate result. We take them true gluten-free, and then they start responding and they start healing. So again, part of it is the test and the technology that's being used. Part of it is the expertise of the doctor, and when it comes to functional medicine, you really want to work with somebody who understands nutrition, because that way it boils down is functional medicine is largely based, as it relates to diet anyway, what you put in your mouth, on nutritional biochemistry. And if you're working with somebody who doesn't have a thorough understanding of that, you're gonna run into problems, and you're gonna continue to struggle. That's just what I see repetitively. Now, some of you may have worked on your own and did really well, and you're feeling really great just with the diet change alone. And to those of you who've had that experience and that success, that's great. That's fantastic. I'm not trying to pick on anybody. I'm just simply saying, if you're struggling and you're not finding answers when you're trying to do it on your own, you really want to work with somebody who can help you. Yeah, I hear you, Bridget. One doctor in Australia, and the waiting time is 8 to 9 months. Yeah, I know, it's a problem, and we're trying to solve that problem. This is part of our mission, is to help 100 million people. I train doctors every year. I take in a group of doctors and train them every year. It is a big part of the problem, is the training. It's a lot of doctors are not getting the training that they need to be able to do these types of things. Here's one, Nancy. The doctors in Canada just don't tell you to check your diet, but just give you pills. Yeah, that's not unlike the doctors in America or the doctors in Europe. They all pretty much espouse the same type of, I'll call it rhetoric, because it certainly isn't healthcare, to give somebody a chemical to artificially manipulate their biochemistry to mask their symptoms so that you can appease them under the guise of compassion. You can appease their symptoms, ease their pain, so to speak, by allowing their pain to continue, because you don't really solve the problem. I mean, that to me is the biggest travesty there. Okay, so Lisa's asking, do genetics or ethnicity determine what food issues we develop? Yeah, genetics can, but less so than what most people realize. I mean, the genetic correlation, the biggest genetic correlation I've seen is with gluten sensitivity. You either have the genes for gluten sensitivity reaction or you don't. And if you do, and you eat gluten, then you activate those genes to produce inflammation, and then it's that inflammation that slowly poisons you over time, destroying your tissues slowly over time. But don't be quick to blame your genetics. Now, there may be some of you with very, very unique cultural or genetic backgrounds. For I don't know if the audience, if there's anyone out there, and let me know if there's anybody out there who's an Inuit Eskimo or a Pima Indian, for an example. Those folks have, really, really high propensity toward high meat diets and high fat diets. Genetically, that's the way they've evolved for thousands and thousands of years. But a lot of you that are out there listening and watching may not have that same, gene pattern. So genetics typically doesn't play as much of a role as we give it credit for, although it can play a role. Let's see here. What about nuts after soaking? So that's a good one, because we didn't really bring up nuts. And typically, for a lot of people, tree nuts are okay. Now there are going to be rare exceptions to that, in my experience. And I know there's a whole protocol called AIP, Autoimmune Paleo, where a lot of people are avoiding all the nuts. And for some people that is necessary. In my experience, for most it is not. So tree nuts, not quite the same genetically as a seed or a legume. They're not quite as hard to digest, and so typically are a lot better tolerated. Now, some people do better when they soak them. I would simply say the one nut that's oftentimes referred to as a nut that's not really a nut, there's actually two. One is the peanut, which is a legume, and so it falls in this category. And the other one is the cashew, which isn't a nut, it's a seed, so it falls into this category. And both of those can contain, peanuts can contain a lot of lectins and mycotoxins that can create gastric distress. And then cashew has it grows on the bottom of a kind of a golden bell-shaped fruit, and it secretes kind of an oil over it that's an irritant. It's a gastric irritant, so that for many people creates a problem. And speaking of gastric irritants, and I didn't put it on here, but one of the other problems, a big one that I think is worth mentioning, is caffeine. A lot of people overconsume caffeine. They're drinking too much coffee, too much tea, and the caffeine in and of itself can be a gastric irritant. So if your gut, again, if it's already damaged and you're over-consuming this can be another one of those things that has a damaging effect on the GI tract, and you should be aware of that. Is there a difference between a doctor who practices integrative medicine and functional medicine? A huge difference. Let's say it like this. Integrative medicine means it's almost like it's a blend. It's integrating some nutrition and some natural medicine with medicine. So an integrative doctor is more kind of blending medicine with nutrition, whereas a functional medicine doctor tends to try to avoid medicine altogether. I mean, the philosophy and the premise of functional medicine is we only use medicine in acute situations where life is imminently in danger and we want to save a person's life. Whereas you know, we don't have a belief pattern that using medicine on a daily basis to suppress symptoms plays a role in health recovery. We believe it actually gives you crutches, you know, proverbial crutches to walk on, and again, giving you false sense of security, and that doesn't serve you in the long run. What serves you are hard truths. A lot of people don't like to hear truth these days. We live in a very politically correct type of world, and people, you know, they're scared to speak the truth and they're scared to hear the truth. But the reality is, you know, well, we could say very honestly, 90+% of all illness that's chronic and degenerative is diet and lifestyle choice based, period. No medicine will ever fix that, so it doesn't make sense to try to use medicine to mitigate that or manage it. It makes better sense to proverbially slap the person in the face with truth so that they at least are awoken to the thought process that the change needs to come from within them. They have the strength to heal themselves. They have the power to heal themselves. But they have to look at those hard truths first and take action on them. Let's see here. This question coming in. Travis says that my friend's son had allergy testing done today. They poked his back and told him he was basically allergic to tons of things, have him a Claritin D prescription, and said, come back in a month. What would you have done? If it were my kid, Travis, I would have walked out. Actually, well, it's not fair because I know what I know. But, you know, what I would have done is I would have taken my son to a different type of doctor who would have run non-skin prick testing. Realize when they do the skin prick test, what are they doing? If you know, they're using corn-based alcohol swab to wipe the back down before they puncture the back with different needle agents that are lined with antigens. And so if you're allergic or reactive to corn alcohol, then you're going to react to everything on that test. It's just, in my opinion, there's a lot of flaw in that type of testing. I prefer an IgE. If they're measuring, because that's what they're measuring in a skin prick, is they're measuring something called an IgE response. You can measure IgE response in the blood, and in my opinion, it's a lot more accurate. And so that's one element that I would recommend would be IgE blood testing. And more specifically, not for environmental stuff, not for the oak and the hay and the pollen, but for food. You can't control the weather, so it doesn't really serve you to know that you're going to react to this, that, and the other as much as it serves you to know that you should not eat certain foods. Because think about it like this, Travis, when your body's immune system is so busy fighting food that it doesn't have the resources to fight the environment, you become hyperallergic. And this is what happens to a lot of these kids. They're hyperallergic and they need to live in their bubble, mainly because all of the food that they're eating is stimulating their immune system and taking the resources away from being able to properly respond to the environment, so they become hyperallergenic. So discern what those foods are first. The foods are more critical because you have 100% control over the diet change. And if you implement that diet change, and you'll see that a lot of people, when they implement diet change, become a lot less allergic to their outdoor allergens. In essence, a lot of people that are told you have outdoor allergens, they don't really have outdoor allergens. They have an overwhelmed immune system, and so they're reacting to lots of things in the environment. But if they just dial that food in and learn what to dial in, they can get that and pull it under control. Is this true? We are not meant to eat grasses because we do not have 4 stomachs like a cow. It's not ideal. No, humans are, look, we can eat a lot of different things. Our gut is designed to break down the nutrients from food that we put in our mouth. And if our gut's really strong and healthy, yes, we can. Now, that being said, 40% of the population, as far as we know, is allergic to grasses. So if you're thinking about things like wild rice, or if you're thinking about other types of grasses to consume, and a lot of people do these green drinks where they're doing the barley and the rye and the oat grasses, I don't recommend those things. They're again, 40% of the population is allergic to grasses, so drinking them in a green juice every day doesn't, in my opinion, doesn't serve you. I talked about this in an email I sent out on Thursday or Friday earlier this week, where I was actually talking about we have a grass drink that is, it's not a grass drink, I'm sorry, it's a green drink that we make out of all organic fruit and vegetables with no grasses in it. So my advice is, if you're going to gravitate toward a drink-based product, it's a green drink, use Ultra Food VF. And because there's no grass in it whatsoever. But no, I don't recommend consuming grass at any degree as a staple food, because you don't have the digestive tract to handle that on a regular basis. Let's see here. Guar gum. Mary Ann is asking about guar gum. Guar gum is actually a lot safer and very well tolerated. So if you're seeing that on one of your food products, then that's one that, again, it's a little bit more well tolerated. Now, some people have trouble with any gums, but if you're not one of them, that's one that's more tolerated. And I think if we can find the link for you, we can put it up in the feed on gums. We have it's a post I have on Gluten Free Society. It's a very thorough one on the toxic food additives and listing of all the different gums that you can read more about. Okay, let's see here. What about ground up seeds? A little bit easier to get access to, because when you grind them up and you break out that outer shell, you're giving your gut and the digestive enzymes and the acid access to the insides of that, so you're able to get to those nutrients. But it still has the anti-nutritive properties, and the seeds still have the sensory proteins in them. So again, in my opinion, it becomes an issue of consumption. And so how often you're consuming them and the quantity, and that's where it can create a problem. So again, I don't recommend seeds as a staple food in your diet where you're using them every day as something that you're eating to get a lot of your calories from it. Does soaking seeds make them easier to digest? Yes, it can. Soak, drain, soak, drain. We mentioned that here a minute ago, and that includes, I mentioned it with the beans, but you can do the same thing with seeds. What type of alcohol is acceptable? Look, I don't recommend alcohol. Alcohol is not acceptable if you're trying to heal. Now, if you are in good health and you want to have an occasional drink, there are a number of different types of alcohol that are grain-free. So if we're talking about gluten sensitivity, there are a number of different kinds. The problem with many of the alcohols is they're poisonous because of the pesticide that is found in a lot of the alcohols. So for example, a lot of your wines contain glyphosate. A lot of even your hard liquors, for example, rum is gluten-free. It's sugarcane. It's distilled down sugarcane. But sugarcane, if they're not using an organic sugarcane, then that sugarcane it's a genetically modified crop. It's being sprayed with glyphosate. So how much of that actually ends up in the alcohol? So I don't recommend using a lot of the alcoholic beverages unless you're finding them in an organic fashion. And then when you do find them in an organic fashion, don't use them liberally, use them very modestly, because alcohol is it's a slow liver poison, and again too much can become a problem. Now again, if you're using it in moderation, I don't think there's a major issue with that if your health is good. But if you've got liver damage or you're trying to recover from years of chronic illness, alcohol should be completely out of your diet. Let's see here. So this question about, do I have anything about macular amyloidosis? Look, amyloidosis is autoimmune disease. You don't need to have specific information about macular amyloidosis. You need to have specific information about what are the triggers for autoimmune disease. Now, I'm going to put up a link here. I want you guys, if you're listening, and maybe this is all new to you, and this is somewhat, when it's new to you, it might be somewhat paralyzing in the sense that it can be overwhelming, right? I do not recommend hair testing for nutritional status. So Tiffany, I think that was your question. Hair testing is not going to give you much on your actual nutritional status. Hair is an excretion material, and so what you're seeing come out in the hair is not necessarily an indicator for what your body is lacking. It could be an indicator for what your body had too much of. Hair can be very, very misleading as a biochemical element to measure. Now, that being said, hair can be somewhat helpful in other ways, but I don't recommend it as a standalone to look at your nutritional status. What are my thoughts on muscle spasm and gluten? Stephanie's asking that question. Very simple. Gluten can cause muscle spasm. Gluten can cause a lot of different symptoms, and muscle spasm is one of them. So if you're struggling with chronic muscle spasm, you're still eating gluten. and you're not sure whether the gluten is causing it, the best thing you can do is get genetically tested to see whether going gluten-free is the right diet for you to follow. Barring that, if you don't want to, expend the money to get the testing done, you can always go on a true gluten-free diet, and that doesn't cost you anything. It just costs you time and effort in terms of cooking and learning. And if your muscle spasm goes away, you kind of have a solid answer there. Okay. It looks like, let's see, is white rice safe or should I just settle for brown rice? Okay, I'm going to let the audience answer that. So those of you who are in the audience who have read No Grain, No Pain, why don't you chime in and answer, I'm going to mangle your name and I apologize if I do, why Jiro Naju, if you guys want to answer him for me, because that's something that I'm hoping that you guys already know the answer to. Okay. So Sophia says, I've gone wheat and dairy free for skin macular amyloidosis and still eating spelt flour. Got to get the spelt flour out, Sophia. That's not doing you any favors. Shannon, do my products ship to Canada? Yes, we do ship to Canada. So, and that includes genetic testing. We do genetic testing all over the world. So it doesn't matter where in the world that you're at, you can still get genetic testing done if you want that. I've heard, Lisa's asking, I've heard some foods that can contain mold, like coffee. Can this hurt someone who's trying to heal from dysfunctional digestive system? It can. It absolutely can. Mold can be a major problem, and I've seen people be allergic to mold. I've seen people be allergic to the toxins that molds produce, like mycotoxins, and there are a number of different forms of mycotoxins. So mold can play a role for many in restricting their capacity for recovery. It's one of the reasons why we check for mold allergy. It's another one of the reasons why I like to check for mycotoxin levels. Mold toxin levels, if they're too high in the system, then we know it's spelling a problem for an individual. All right, lots of you are answering the rice question. Thank you for chiming in, folks, on that. Okay, let's do, I love this question because it comes up a lot. Is magnesium stearate okay? Yes, it's okay. There's some articles on the internet that really talk very poorly about magnesium stearate. And magnesium stearate is perfectly safe. It does not create a biofilm in the gut. It does not bog down the gut. It's actually, for those of you who aren't familiar with supplemental manufacturing, when you're trying to produce different supplements, when you're mixing powder, it's not the same thing as mixing liquids. When you mix liquids, you stir them and they typically blend together very nicely. But this doesn't occur as well with powder. So when you're mixing in powder, oftentimes you have to use what's called a flow agent. It basically helps the powders mix together so that you get, in this capsule you get 100 milligrams and in this capsule you get 100 milligrams. Otherwise, if you're mixing powders with different densities, what ends up happening is this capsule gets 10 milligrams, this one gets 90, etc., etc., etc. You don't end up with an even mix. So sometimes there are flow agents that are used, and there's some flow agents that are good and there's some flow agents that are not so good. Some companies use, for example, rice flour as a flow agent. In my opinion, it's a very poor flow agent because a lot of the rice is contaminated with arsenic, cadmium, beside the fact that it can contain a form of rice gluten that is known to create an intestinal inflammation. So bad in the case, if you're gluten sensitive, it's a very poor choice of filler. Even if you're not gluten sensitive, it's a poor choice of filler because of the heavy metal issues that surround rice. Whereas magnesium stearate has none of those issues. Very safe. Even if you have 6 different supplements that all have magnesium stearate, it's still very safe to use. No side effects in the way of that. So I hope that answers your question. Another very common filler that's used sometimes is silicate, which is basically silicone or it's a element found naturally in the Earth's crust. Again, it can be used as a flow agent because it's a non-toxic inert flow agent. So it doesn't add anything to a product, but it's just used to make sure that it mixes well so that, again, each capsule that you take has, consistent dose. So good question. I'm glad somebody asked it because I've been meaning to address that question for a while. Is there any starch that is safe? Yeah, I mean, there's plenty of starches that is safe. It just depends on who the person is, though. I mean, again, one man or woman's food is another man or woman's poison. And so it really boils down to that. Starch is not bad for you. Carbohydrates are not bad for you. As popular as the ketogenic diet is right now, it's a trend and a fad. Not everybody should be on the ketogenic diet. It's not God's diet that's going to save everybody from every disease ever. It's being highly popularized right now. And there are some people where it's very effective to do certain things, but we don't necessarily want to just say everybody in the world needs to be on a no carb diet. We've made that mistake. Look, low fat diets, low fat no fat diets, low protein diets. How many times are we going to repeat history and make those same mistakes? It's not about cutting a particular macronutrient out. It's not about cutting out carbs, fats, or proteins. It's about balance. It's about having a good balance. I like the rule of thirds. Meaning that when you're looking at your plate, a third carbohydrate, a third protein, and a third fat. That's equal. It's equality. That's balance between your macros on your plate. So as opposed to just saying all carbohydrates are bad, look, the reason why carbohydrates are bad today is because we just went through 30 years where every food, every processed food item, they were adding carbohydrates because they were taking the fat out of it, so they had to add something to make it taste good. So what did they add? They added carbohydrate sugar. And so now we've got 30 years of carbohydrate toxicity, so everybody's now running in the opposite direction. Well, it's not the exact correct run. Yes, people have to pull back on the carbohydrates, but it doesn't mean no carbohydrates. So let's be very, very clear that carbs are not bad. Excessive carbs are bad. Okay. Well, I got more questions, but I got no time. So, folks, this has been a great evening. Thanks for spending it with me. Again, if you're new to the Dr. Osborne Show, the Pick Dr. Osborne's Brain occurs every Monday night at 6 p.m. Central Standard Time. So tune back in next Monday. If you want reminders, go over to glutenfreesociety.org. Make sure that you sign up for our free newsletter. We'll also send you a gluten-free survival kit. So make sure if you don't have that, if you haven't picked that up already, go and pick that up. Also, make sure you click on the gear or the subscribe button, either above me or below me, and make sure that you're subscribing to our feed if you want to get notifications of when we're going live. Sometimes we do impromptu lives where we just go live in the middle of the day, and if you're there and if you get a notification, you get access to that information. So make sure you subscribe. You can also go over to youtube.com/glutenology. You can subscribe to us at Facebook at Dr. Peter Osborne. And you can subscribe to us on Instagram at Dr. Osborne. So we'll see you next week. Have a fantastic rest of your week. This is Dr. Osborne with the Pick Dr. Osborne's Brain Show signing out. Hey, if you've got a functional medicine or health question that you'd like me to answer for you, make sure you send me an email, glutenology@gmail.com, and we'll do our best to create a video answer just for you. Have a great day.